Be a survivor, not a statistic. Renegade River in Spring Lake has new and used handguns, hunting guns, sporting goods, and survival gear. Protect your rights and your freedom. Ask about their CPL classes. Renegade River, next to the police station in downtown Spring Lake.
The Talk of Muskegon. News Talk 1090, WKBZ.
Welcome. You're listening to the Mike Hewitt Show. My name is Mike Hewitt, and good news. This is a First Amendment freedom zone. On the line with us today is my guest, Pete Konetchy, who is a candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives from Michigan's 4th District. Pete, welcome back to the Mike Hewitt Show.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here.
Hey, it's great to have you here. Hey, a little bit, I've got a whole list of things I want to go over, but before we get going, your race up there, you were a primary challenger at one point, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
And now it's an open primary, and from this far away at least, it looks like you're a measurable front runner.
I certainly hope so. I jumped in the race, as you probably know, last July, and I did challenge Camp when he was still running. So I'm unusual in that aspect.
Yeah, that's I think, wise on his part.
Right.
Hey, first off, happy Easter to you and Mrs. Konetchy. And I want to express some appreciation that I was able to get you to join me. I think most of the shows I listened to today on the way in were cut from who knows when because today's Easter, and here you and I are live on the radio. So I wanted to thank you and your family for letting you join us. But I think that's the price of being a candidate, isn't it?
It's my pleasure. When you introduced the show, you mentioned in jest the First Amendment zone. But when I looked at the Clive Bundy situation out in, the West, that really repulsed me, to be honest with you. Because how can the government go through and just mention that there's a First Amendment zone that people can protest in, but outside that we have no rights? I just wanted to bring that up because that really disgusts me.
I got to tell you, we talked about that a little bit last week. One of the things I found fascinating about that First Amendment area, I think is how the sign read,
right,
is that when I Googled it, I had initially wanted to get a picture of that particular zone. It looks like they used snow fence and a big circle out in the middle of the desert with a mountain in the background. It said, you folks, including Thomas Jefferson, you can go stand in that zone area there and talk. But listen, I Googled that just to find that image, typed it in, First Amendment area, went to Google Images, hit search, and Pete, I came up with those signs all over America, not just in that particular Bundy instance out in the middle of the Nevada desert, but there's a sign in Ohio, there's signs in Connecticut, there's signs in Indiana. I couldn't find a state that didn't have some area, mostly national parks, that didn't have or bear some semblance of that sign. And I found that frightening.
I do too. We were at Michigan State a while ago, and there was a gentleman talking, and he was in a free speech zone on Michigan State. So he could say anything he wanted there, but once he left that free speech zone, he was not able to speak his mind. And I've seen many instances where on Constitution Day, kids were trying to give out copies of the Constitution, and they were actually, punished for doing so outside of these, First Amendment or free speech zones. And that's disgusting, in my opinion. What I know is that our Bill of Rights, they're constitutionally protected rights, and they're not granted by the government. Obviously, they're granted by God as free men. But they represent absolute restrictions against government infringement. But our government today just considers them privileges, and they can treat them as they will, and the government feels they can take them away or allow us to exercise them at government's will, and I cannot accept that whatsoever.
Justice Scalia recently said, in fact, he was offering his opinion. I can't quote him, but he was offering his opinion on a couple issues, including the NSA, and he made a quip about how there's few or no rights that are absolute. And then he used as an example that the TSA, the fondling searches that take place at our airports is reasonable. And so when you look at the Fourth Amendment, one of the catchwords that type of mentality loves to hang its hat on is the word unreasonable search and seizure. And so they can, that old adage that says the human mind is powerful, it can rationalize anything. And so suddenly, and I don't want to be glib here, but right out of Nazi Germany, anything becomes reasonable in the pursuit of whatever it is agendas that they're advancing.
Right, but there's one aspect of it, and if you read the, and I'm sure you have, but it's the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798 when Thomas Jefferson talks about the overreach of government. And one thing that he points out, which I agree with wholeheartedly, is that the federal government is not able to police itself, and that the only ones who can police the actions or justify whether they're correct or not are the parties to the Constitution, which are the states. And you have lawyers in Washington that are going to twist every single word possible, and they can't. The states have to go through and say, look, we can determine what's reasonable and what's unreasonable, and the federal government cannot do so.
What's fascinating to me on those points, though, Pete, is that situations, for instance, where Harry Reid refers to the supporters of Bundy as being domestic terrorists. It's easy for me to say that's repulsive, but what concerns me is way beyond Harry Reid, and that's the sheer volumes of people that support him when he makes those bombastic statements.
That's right. Well, you looked at the Joint Task Force on Terrorism, their criteria for domestic terrorists. And one of the criteria are people who support the Constitution or make numerous references to the Constitution. And the sad part is that every single one of our founding fathers would be considered domestic terrorists by the current government. And the funny thing is that they had the exact same status in the Revolutionary War when they revolted against King George, because they were considered terrorists, and they knew that they were, pledging their lives and their fortunes to defend liberty. And I hate to say it, but we're coming in the exact same situation right now. And unless we can turn this thing around, we're going to lose, our freedom.
I have to tell you on that point, first off, I'm not convinced we can turn it around until we save the American family. And I fervently believe that. When I look at all of the crime statistics, drug use, sexual assault, suicide, almost all, up into 75 to 80% of those numbers are coming from single-parent families, and I'm not blaming that on the single parent trying to be a parent. I'm blaming it on the destruction of the American family.
Right.
And the uber left. I don't mean people that are just regular Democrats or regular moderates of whatever party they assign themselves to, but the extreme left are absolutely bent on doing that. And here on Easter Sunday, I've got in my notes to make sure we talk about the war against Christianity, and that was another thing that. And I'm not a religious zealot by any means, but to me, when I look at those things, Pete, that are causing the underpinnings of America to fall apart, I can't help but to say that this is done on purpose.
It is.
That's fearsome to me. That there are people with big funding behind them that are working to destroy Christianity, working to destroy the American family, to pull the underpins of the value of the dollar out. Everything that makes America strong is being eroded away.
I agree. I totally agree. And everything that's being done is being done outside of constitutional authority. It's kind of tough because the way I look at it is that I see the federal government collecting so much money from the people, and then they take that money. First, they fund a huge bureaucracy, but then what they do with this money is they give it back to the people with conditions attached. And one of them are the welfare system, as you mentioned. And for whatever reason, if you're a single woman, you get more money than a married woman because the government figures that single women need more money than married women. And then if you are a single woman with children, then you get even more money than a single woman without children. And that encourages the breakup of the family. And then it's a vicious circle because if you're in a poor family and you know that your sustenance is coming from government, there's no real need to get an education because you figure, what's the use? I'm just going to be dependent on government anyways, and if I try to better myself, I'll lose my benefits. So it's a coordinated effort by our government to break up the family.
I think you're right, but when I try to figure out, it's fairly easy for us to sit back and identify what are some of the problems, or maybe even a majority of them. But when I try to get my head around the idea of how do we stop it, then I look to things like party politics, which I think is one of the greatest tools that are being used against a strong America.
I agree, but I know how to stop it.
I'm ready. Tell me.
I was talking to Michelle Bachmann at CPAC, not this year but last year, and she said very clearly that 70% of all the money that the federal government collects for social programs is spent funding a federal bureaucracy, and only 30% goes to the intended recipients. And I look at that and I say, it's such a waste. And plus, it's not constitutional. My feeling is that we have to restructure the funding of the federal government so that the states collect, in this case, just 30% of what we now send to Washington for social programs. They can provide the exact same level of social service, probably more because they won't have the federal restrictions associated with them. But then the 70% that's not sent to Washington can be kept by the people that earned it, and they can use it for true wealth creation, job development, research and development, promotion, and so forth and so on. Truly create wealth and uplift the communities rather than having it go to Washington and just be wasted.
Tell me something, Pete. Let me just interrupt you for just a second. When on the monies that you're proposing should continue to go, would you like to see that in a scaled-down version of our current tax code, or would you rather a fair tax or a flat tax? What are you thinking in terms of how that revenue stream should take place?
What I'd like to do is I'd like to do it exactly as the original Constitution proposed. I'd like the government to be funded by duties ex post and that way initially. And I know that's not nearly enough to fund the government, so I'm not under illusions that that's going to happen. But then the difference needs to be taxed directly to the states, not to the people, based on the percentage of population. And that makes perfect sense because then the government never has a deficit because whatever is needed is taxed to the states. It does away with the IRS, so you don't have this repressive body, collecting money from the people, and we'll handle it. That way the government also just collects whatever is needed for its enumerated functions. And I would love the states to actually audit the federal government, not the Fed, but the federal government, so that we can break all spending into constitutionally enumerated functions, how much is spent on defense, immigration, weights and measures, courts, whatever, then how much is spent outside of its authority on health and human services, education, energy, housing, and whatever. And the federal government should not have any authority over those other non-constitutional issues, and the states should handle them much more efficiently.
The problem, as I see it with that, is that there's a lot of people, both elected and not, on the lobbying side that are making a ton of dough. And an example of that, we talk about the Bundy circumstance, and they spent a little over $3 million on their siege on liberty to collect what they say that their goal was to collect almost $1 million in late fees, and they spent over $3 million to do it.
And they destroyed his property.
And while they were being good stewards to spend $3 million to collect $1 million, at the exact same time, you got the same federal government taking Mary Bryce's tax return because when her father died in 1960, they overpaid his family. And you go, what? How can a citizen sitting here in Muskegon or there in Roscommon look at that concept and say, that's the kind of government I want, one that would take that lady's money while blowing $3 million over on this side to collect $1 million? I mean, the problem, what I'm getting at, Pete, is to me the problem is the electorate, the citizens. Their eyes glaze over and they just don't pay attention to those details, but those details are, to me, they're alarming beyond measure.
They are. And it's not so much that, the people allow it to happen, because I haven't talked to anyone that wants, more government or is happy with the performance of our current government. But far too many have become depressed, disappointed, and have simply given up. They say, what difference, will it make to vote for a conservative or whatever? Because, first of all, everyone in Washington is exactly the same, and they're all going to, in effect, mistreat us, screw us over. and it's sad, but that's how a lot of people feel.
Yeah.
And
the problem with that thought process, Pete, you're right, first off, I agree with you. The problem with it is that they've not usurped any power. They've not taken wrongfully away any power from the American people that the American people didn't freely give them, either through apathy or ignorance.
Exactly. And that's why right now we have to take it back. And we can easily take it back. That's why I think the supporters of Clive Bundy, who actually stood up to the Bureau of Land Management and said, no, we're not going to submit to your dictates, they were heroes. And luckily, the press came out and reported that deal that Harry Reid made with the Chinese, solar panel company and so forth and so on, which kind of threw mud on his face, hopefully.
It didn't seem to bother him. He went right on rants from there on out about how they're all a bunch of domestic terrorists.
That's right.
That was his response.
That's right. And they aren't, obviously. They're heroes. And that's where we have to throw, Harry Reid out of office. We have to throw the establishment of both parties, because I think the establishment of both parties basically are the problem.
They
Both
are
want power. They just want to be in charge of the power.
Yep, they are, and are in collusion to keep that power. Something happened yesterday, 239 years ago.
That's right. Revolutionary War started.
It really did, and folks don't pay attention to that. They don't teach it. They don't teach the fact that those people were not only informed and virtuous, but they were willing to put everything out on the red line and say, this is where we're going to stop you.
Exactly. And what they did is they realized that liberty was the most important thing they could attain, and that every other good virtue, such as prosperity and morality and charity, would be derived from liberty. But without liberty, we have nothing.
We're gonna go to a break in just a minute, but when we come back, I'm wanting to talk a little bit of some national security issues, and specifically some comments from Congressman King of New York that I'm wanting to get your opinion on.
Okay.
So, folks, we will be right back in just a few moments. Welcome back to the Mike Hewitt Show. My name is Mike Hewitt, and you are back in the First Amendment zone. We're on today with Pete Konetchy, who is a candidate for the State House of Representatives in Michigan's 4th District. Pete, when we went to break, I wanted to get you off on this Congressman King comments. I don't know if you heard him or not, but he recently was in an interview. He's contemplating being a presidential candidate. And in one of the interviews he gave, he expressed that the reason that he's thinking about running is that he doesn't want the voices of isolationism, and he cited Cruz and Rand Paul as being the only voice heard from the Republican Party. And so when I thought about that at great length, Pete, I kept in my mind hearkening back to quotes offered both by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, where both of them said variations of the same thing, which was commerce with all nations, alliance with none should be our motto. That was specifically Thomas Jefferson. And I bring that up now because if you should win, you're going to have an opportunity to vote on some of these issues. And for me, I'm a Jeffersonian, but I'm most certainly not an isolationist. I think that America, as it's always been, should be doing business with countries all over the world, regardless of their religious and form of government, et cetera. I don't. To me, business is separate than that. And when I look at the bases that we've got all over America, I have often said and expressed in my first novel that those things are the steps of global socialism, which I reject out of hand. So with that, am I crazy or is Congressman King on the wrong foot? What do you think?
Well, I think it deals with definitions for the most part. And as far as isolationism, it's whether we want to be the world's policeman or not. And we're not supposed to be the world's policeman. Commerce is perfect. Because if we have commerce with other nations, first we build relations with them, and then we can also encourage those nations to emulate freedom and liberty, through trade and commerce. If we're a world's policeman, then what we're basically saying is that we want to dominate or occupy other nations, and I don't agree with the latter. I agree with Jefferson totally.
When I look at it, I always have a tendency of trying to reduce this down to little microcosms that I can understand. But when I look at those nations in the world right now that have developed upon their own marketplace a strong outreaching commerce, most of them are very strong in terms of, when I say strong, I'm speaking in terms of lifestyle, the ability for their citizens to speak freely, those countries that have a good financial foundation. So if America, the folks on the right or the very left, if they think that we should be in a place to help advance freedom, I think the best advance of freedom is to help nations, not purposefully, but through commerce, to build their own infrastructure and to build their own financial base.
I totally agree. And the other thing that I look at is when young men join the Army, like I have 2 kids who are in the Army, they signed up to defend our nation from attack, to defend our values. They didn't sign up to fight in wars in lands unknown that the outcome has no bearing whatsoever on the United States. They fought to defend, our lifestyle and our freedom. And that's what I think is extremely important.
Where we get off into the gray areas.
Well, there's one other thing. I'm sorry.
Sure. Go ahead.
As far as with King versus Cruz and Paul, The thing is that there are other voices out there, such as McCain and Lindsey Graham and other senators. But the thing is that the Republican base, as well as most of the people of the United States, don't agree with those voices. They don't agree with expansionism or, military proudness of the United States. And they do want to have I don't think they want to have people overseas fighting battles that have no bearing on the United States. And that's what Cruz and Lee are basically saying. They want to have an extremely powerful military, but we want to have relations throughout the world, as you mentioned, through commerce. And I think that's why Cruz and Lee are held up as benchmarks, not because they're the only voices, but they're the voices that people agree with.
I think that's absolutely correct. For me, I'm a hawk. I want the strongest military in the world, but I want that military defending America and America's borders, not flung out across 1,000 bases that are stretched out. 150 sovereign nations have our U.S. military bases on them. I think that's insane, and not only do I think it's insane, I think it's problematic.
I do too.
And I often use the example, there's a Home Depot in Grand Haven. If all of a sudden that had been taken over by, now just arbitrarily picked, the Turkish military and turned it into a Turkish military base, I'm wondering how West Michigan would look at Turkey. Exactly. And so then when I try to dial it into real life, because I often hear, in fact, I've used the analogy myself, if the world community were neighbors on a street, and you looked across kitty corner across the street from you, and you saw that the neighbor's out beating his wife and daughter in the front yard, and you see violence perpetually, do you get involved? Do you close the the curtains on your front window so you pretend it doesn't, it's not there? So I understand the rationale that says we need to protect our allies. I just don't think we need to have 2 million armed and civilian personnel stretched across 1,000 military bases to be able to do that.
That's right. And the thing is the analogy that you mentioned is fine, but there's always going to be countries that are, domineering and repressive. And our country, in effect, is becoming one of them, even though I hate to say so. But the thing is that the people of the country have to stand up, and the people of the country have to say no and exercise their God-given rights. And unless the people do it, then they're never going to win. So if we go into some country and we overthrow the government for whatever reason, take Iraq as an example, Afghanistan, what we were trying to do there, unless the people, have the same values themselves, it's never going to last. It's going to be a wasted effort.
Pete, I've, as you're aware, I've had your wife on the show, on my show, maybe a year ago, and it's one of the most fascinating interviews I think I've had on the show. First, I want to say that, and I still appreciate it and refer to her back often. But I bring that up now because while we're talking about world politics, knowing her relationship to the former Soviet Union as a citizen, a person that was born and raised and educated there, I'm kind of looking for your input with that as a foundation to say, what do you think Putin's really doing, and what role should we take, if any, given what's happening in Ukraine?
What you'll have to do is, I'll be more than happy to give you my take, but you're absolutely right about my wife. She has great insight, and at some point in time you should probably have her on the phone because she can discuss it in far greater detail. But my view whatsoever is, first of all, the people in the Ukraine, they do have Russian heritage, and they have a long line of Russian heritage. And now they're being forced into a situation where they have to choose, do they want to stay part of Russia, or do they want to become part of the European Union? And regardless of what they decide, it's not our concern in the United States, none whatsoever. And I'd never want to see our guys fighting over there for quote-unquote freedom. The Ukrainians have to do it themselves. But as far as Putin, he's just doing what's best for his country. And you have to look at it, this might be a simplistic example, but assume, we have Puerto Rico as an example. And some faction in Puerto Rico overthrew the government, and so they wanted to align with Cuba rather than with the United States. And if the people of Puerto Rico had a vote and they said, let's stay with the United States rather than going to Cuba, would that be considered a valid election, or would it not be a valid election? And it would be, and that's basically what happened with Russia. From a simplistic view.
The fascinating thing with that comparison that you've made, and I didn't reach to Cuba or to Puerto Rico, and that's what's interesting given the fact that they're a territory.
Right.
But what I have said in the past is that to me this is kind of a states' rights issue. I think our founders would be absolutely flabbergasted if they knew that a state did not have the right to cast a vote and either stay a part of or to secede from the Union.
Exactly.
That was obviously prosecuted in the Civil War, and that side lost. Not the side of the South, but the side of states' rights lost. And then it was echoed in the 1869 Supreme Court decision that said you do not, as a state, have a right to secede. And of course, I continue to support that right. So when I watched Crimea, I absolutely agreed. If the majority of the folks there want to become a part of Russia, I think it's their right, and it's none of my business.
Plus the other thing is Russia has a huge naval base there.
Yeah.
And if we had a huge naval, well, we do in Puerto Rico. If there was uprisings there, we would probably fortify our base for one thing. And Russia was putting troops on their border. It's similar to like if we had something going on with Mexico, we'd put troops on our border just to protect the United States.
Now would be a good time because we do have something going on with Mexico. We've got about 50 million of their citizens living here, still maintaining their citizenship there, but living here.
You know, that's amazing because I was looking at it with the Clyde Bundy situation. And the thing is if they could have federal agents there and, secure that area so totally against United States citizens, why can't they do the same thing on the border? That's their constitutional obligation. Whoops. My alarm just went off. Someone came in.
That's going to happen on Easter Sunday.
That's right.
That's very, very cool. Well, those are interesting topics. And by the way, I'm going to take you up on your suggestion. If Mrs. Konetchy is willing, somewhere this coming month, I'll have her back on because
she would love that.
Yeah, when I start looking at first off in the Crimea, I agree. It gets a little bit murky for me because I just don't understand the Ukrainian. I don't know if it's sectioned off into states or provinces, or I don't understand how that politics works in terms of units, and so. And at the same time, I push back a little bit because I'm still of our founders' mentality that says that a pure democracy or just a vote is going to just crush the minority, and I'm not an advocate of that either. So
right.
I'll have to have her help coach me through that.
She is. She's been researching it a lot. She does a lot of posts on Facebook and talks to a lot of people. Reads Russian documents. Listens to Russian TV and so forth. So she would be terrific to talk to.
Yeah, we'll do that. Tell me this though, on back with you, the IRS. Can they? What is your opinion of the IRS and their seizing of debt owed by a family member, as in the case that I mentioned early on, where they took this lady's tax return for a debt that was caused when she was 5 in 1960?
It's kind of funny because the IRS cannot do it. And I get so frustrated because just about every answer to every question is the government can't do it, but they do it anyways.
Right.
One thing that we have is we have the Fifth Amendment. And the Fifth Amendment says you can't take property without due process of law. And there's no law whatsoever. Well, if you look at Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution, it lists the duties of Congress, and it says Congress can only make laws pertaining to its enumerated powers. So it can make laws dealing with defense, immigration, whatever. But it can't make any law dealing with education, with housing, with energy, with anything else because it has no authority. So when the IRS goes through and they take this money from this woman, they can't do it because they have no authority. But they do it anyways because of a couple of reasons. First, they feel that they're above the law, for one thing. They feel that they want, in my opinion, they want to suppress the people of the United States and make them fear government, which is despicable, but it's working. And they can do it. They can get away with it. So
they get away with it because they get away with it, Pete, because we allow them to.
Right.
And then when we get into primary elections on either side, doesn't matter whether it's Republican or Democrat, the incumbent wins because people aren't paying attention. And one of the things that Ben Carson recently said was that he offered as a quip that he wished that when you went into the ballot, you're standing in a voting booth and you're looking at the list of names on the ballot, that it didn't say R or D beside the person's name, which would cause the people to have to pay attention to who these people are running for office and what they're really saying. One of the things I've prided in this show is one of the goals is that as I've been interviewing a lot of candidates for the last year with the express purpose of A, giving them a venue, but B, for the ones that win, then I watch what they do in Lansing or in D.C., and they better do what they said they're going to do.
Hold them accountable.
Yeah, because I'm going to say, hey, not only did you say this, but let me replay the quote for you. Because I think what happens when folks get there is that the caucuses get a hold of them, put their arm around them, take them into a room and explain how they used to be stupid, but now they're brilliant.
Right.
and the lobbyists get a hold of them and say, how much does it take to fund, to max you out? Here's $5,000. Just vote this way, just this one time. But listen, on the topic of the IRS taking this lady's money, and I hope listeners don't roll their eyes at me because I mean this quite seriously. Item number 3 is I'm reading from the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. That's why I say please don't roll your eyes at me. Oscar, stay awake. And item 3 is abolition of rights of inheritance. I bring that up because there's a sizable portion of the American electorate and those who are elected that think it's okay to have monster-sized death tax. And what brings us to mind is the idea that we're still chasing after this guy's ill-gotten booty from 54 years ago from the IRS. They truly don't want people to leave assets to the next generation.
I agree.
And that's a flabbergasting statement to make. But when people appear to be perpetually stuck in low middle class incomes or lower, that's done on purpose. It's done by allowing poor education with, in my opinion, things like Common Core, or even before that, No Child Left Behind and No Education Advanced. What do you think?
I totally agree. I couldn't have said it better. The thing is that, if you can destroy private property, you can destroy the livelihood of the people, and everyone is therefore going to be dependent on government.
And the fascinating part about that is that the extraordinary left will talk about having absolute equality. I got to tell you, Pete, I'm on board with the idea of absolute economic opportunity.
That's what it is, opportunity.
Okay, I want us all to have. We're all at the same starting line. The bell rings, the horn blows, the gun goes off. I can't say gun. Something goes off to indicate that the race has begun. And everyone, I want that equal opportunity. I don't want anybody for any reason held back from an opportunity to begin. But don't climb on my back and expect me to run the race with you on it. It's not going to happen.
Well, it's kind of like what you were saying as far as equal opportunity, because, I live up in the middle of nowhere in Roscommon, and I actually supplement my heating with wood. So yesterday I was outside and I was chopping wood and splitting wood. And I was thinking, here I am making an effort to go through and chop my wood and split it and whatever, so I have wood and everything for the winter. But then I was thinking, what happens if my neighbor just decides not to do that, and they sit around watching TV or, doing whatever they want to do. And then when winter comes, they say, I have no wood. Should I be forced to give them my wood against my will because I took the initiative to go through and harvest it?
Only seems fair, Pete. By the way, I want some of your wood too. The reason I didn't burn this year is I'm too lazy. But listen, we've got to go to a break, and when we come back, let's talk about city mouse, country mouse. Okay?
Okay.
We'll be right back, folks.
You're listening to News Talk 1090 WKBZ.
Welcome back to the Mike Hewitt Show, and welcome back to the First Amendment Zone. Pete Konetchy is with us. Pete, when we went to break, I kind of offered a little bit of quip, the city mouse, country mouse. And the reason I'm bringing that up now is it seems that that's kind of the divide. The folks in the city are going to vote leaning towards much more regulation and et cetera, and the folks out in the country that are cutting wood tend to be a lot more liberty orientated. Am I right?
Right. I believe so.
How can we find some commonality with each other, the city folks and the country folks?
See, and that's where, if I'm elected to Congress, my goal is not going to be to cut benefits necessarily, because that's not my job. My job is to go through and transfer responsibility for benefits away from the federal government to the states. And I was even talking to some, hardcore liberals about that, and as soon as they understood the concept, they agreed with it wholeheartedly. And the concept is, and if we can explain that to people, like I was saying before about Michelle Bachmann stating that 70% of the money collected by the federal government for social services are spent on bureaucracy. If we can explain to people that the states can collect the same amount, while they can collect just 30% of what we send to the federal government now and provide the exact same level of social service, but what's not collected by the federal government can be used for, true wealth creation, then hardcore liberals have to understand that it's much better to allow the states to take care of their own needs rather than the federal government. Once we get that point across, then we'll have 50 individual states that are addressing the same problems. States always have an incentive to actually solve the problem rather than just address them. So the solutions that are, quote-unquote best will be emulated by the states throughout the nation, and the solutions that are bad will be dropped. So that's what we have to do. We just have to explain that we don't want to cut services, cut people off, but just allow the states to handle them in the most efficient manner.
Now and you mentioned earlier, I think you said 2/3, I can't remember the percentages that you offered, but it goes to the administrative waste of the dollars that are sent to the
70%.
federal 70, and I've heard figures as high as 87%.
Right.
And so and the reason there's a difference, by the way, folks, is that different departments are different. Like I recently heard, made me raise an eyebrow, is that everyone sees the commercials where there's a big push to hire veterans coming back from Afghanistan and the Iraqi wars, and so when you look at the federal government, which is just big, gigantic, bloated pool of bureaucratic employees nowadays, at least it seems to me. But with that big push to hire these folks, one would think that the government would be the most logical place for these folks to end up with job opportunities. And first off, that's not the case. The majority are not. If you look at the pool of the federal employees, there is not an overwhelming number. In fact, it's lesser than the private sector are hiring these returning vets. But then specifically where I wanted to go with this is Health and Human Services, one that you would think would have a big heart and be willing to do something for these folks that are having a heck of a time finding a job, and they're like 2% of their employee pool are returning vets. I say that only because I think it dovetails a little bit with the state of mind of the federal government, which is not to help people, irony being what it is. I mean, that's all the push for the money is we're here to help and we need this to do that. And that's not what their goal is. Their goal is to foster growth within their own organizations.
That's right.
Both financially for themselves and also as a power base. When I listen to your approach, it sounds to me like you're trying to shift the burden to the states so that we, the people, can have a greater grasp of controlling it.
Exactly.
Did I say that correctly?
That's exactly right. The best government is always, closest to the people. So the local government should have the most control over the people, and then the states can provide for other services that the people want within the jurisdiction. But the federal government is not benevolent, like you say. And this was proved with the government shutdown, when the first thing the government did was tried to close the open-air memorials and other things they had no authority to do, but they did it anyways because they wanted to make it as inconvenient for the people as possible. That's nothing more than blackmail by your own government.
That's exactly right. But it goes to the example I cited in the first segment, which is where the government spends in excess of $3 million to collect $1 million in late fees.
That's right.
Clearly, dollars and being fiscally responsible and those things are not what's in their. That's not what they're thinking.
And what they want to do is they want to destroy someone to make an example of them, so other people will, quiver in fear.
Fall in line.
Confront the federal government. Just submit.
Yeah, and then if you run around using words like fiscally responsible or constitutionalist, you are immediately branded as an extremist.
As a domestic terrorist.
Yeah, that would be me. Evidently, I'm a domestic terrorist, and since
I know. That's why I'm a little worried talking to you.
I can't blame you at all, but I'm one of those fellows that wherever I go, whether it's here on the air or in my store in Spring Lake and driving down the road, wherever I'm at, the First Amendment zone is right over me. It follows me because I can't keep my mouth shut when I see these things that I think are absolutely deviant from anything that's going to be a strong America.
See, and I heard a wonderful woman, her name was Chris Ann Hall, just a while ago, and she makes the point over and over again how the people of the United States have to stand up and assert our constitutional rights. And we have to. And that's why I was so pleased with the protesters at the Bundy situation, because they weren't cowering or whatever before government. They just, said no.
Yeah.
What we have to do.
And I think Harry Reid was going, what do you mean no? I've got a lot of money at stake here.
Exactly. And the government, I get so sick of saying it. They can't do what they're doing, but they do it anyways because people don't fight. And we have to fight. And I'm not saying, violently, but we have to fight for our constitutional rights and just refuse to submit.
The problem with it is, though, Pete, and I'm not trying to be negative today, but the problem is if you go out and do a person on the street interview, who's the vice president, who's Speaker of the House, name any founding father and what that person's role was in our founding, name who we sought freedom from. The average person on the street, and I don't want to point with a broad brush because there's a lot of very smart, well-educated people in America, but the average person on the street is totally stumped at some of these questions that, to me, are should have been taught in third grade.
But the other thing is and I totally agree, I'm not disputing that whatsoever, but the other thing that's a little bit encouraging is if you talk to local businesses, like when I collected my signatures, I introduced myself to local businesses throughout the entire district here. No one that I talked to was happy with government. Everyone was, wanted just to have government out of their lives. They had conservative values, basically. And they're the people that actually vote. And that's why it's so discouraging, because most of those people feel that there's nothing they can do. And they've just more or less given up or submitted or accept any dictate from the federal government. But they have the same values that we do, and if we can go through and give them a little bit of leadership, like with the Reagan-type person, and maybe Ted Cruz can do it, then we can get our country back.
Have you been following the information dump coming from the Clinton administration?
Yeah. Documents
that are slowly being poured out into the public from when he was president? I just read an article yesterday where one of the dumps that came from that information surge left over from the Clinton era was where the administration was very concerned about the growing internet. So we're talking early to mid 90s, because they felt it would be a place for people to gather and share information outside of the controlled information coming from D.C. and the loyal media. Mm-hmm. And I'm reading that thinking, that's what they were concerned of losing is all of the things our founding fathers fought to gain.
Exactly. That's obviously the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and how do you define press?
The right to assemble.
I mean,
when I look at all of the nations in the world that we point to as being wrong, the Soviet Union, Cuba, etc., all of these bear the same marker that they don't have the right to assemble. And yet, by the way, I'm not trying to be partisan against Clinton or pro-Democrat, Republican, none of that. I'm looking at an administration that, frankly, is very representative of the Bush era, the Clinton era, the Nixon era, all the way back to probably Coolidge, that says we can control the message and control the national dialogue. That's a fearsome government that can do that. Mm-hmm. So tell me, before we run out of time today, I'd mentioned earlier, I wanted to ask you what committees, we've got about 3 minutes left, Oscar's telling me. If you win, what kind of committees, tell me again, you wanted to be on?
Well, the big thing is I understand that unless we get spending and debt under control, we will not exist as a nation, and we have to do it immediately. We can't have our kids do it. So I'd like to be on the appropriations or budget, to start. The other thing is I'm very, very fearful about the police state that we're evolving into. So I'd also like to be on the Homeland Security Committee, because I want to make sure that the police are basically, that they have higher standards than most people in society, because they have power that they can exert over people. So I'd love to be on Homeland Security. I'd like to be on the judiciary, because I'm sick of having, judicial activism. So I'd like to go through, and if there's judges that are, pursuing judicial activism, I'd like to have them impeached.
Yeah, from either side, by the way.
Either side, right. I'm not a party person. I'm running as a Republican, only because the Republicans are supposed to be the party of, smaller government, less taxes, less spending. But the leadership of the Republican Party...
You're a historian, Pete.
What?
You must be a historian.
But the leadership of the Republican Party is no different than that of the Democratic Party. And I have no allegiance to the leadership of the Republican Party. My allegiance is totally to the Constitution.
I'm glad you said judiciary. People have often heard me say, or I've often said, that I believe the judiciary is our single most broken branch of government. It's the least exposed, the most out of the way from the public to view. I think that most people were taught in school that we've got this great judicial branch. No other country in the world has got it. innocent until proven guilty and all of the things that go along with it. And folks, that's not how it operates. Go spend a week in any city court, and I don't care whether it's criminal or family, or it doesn't matter. Go spend a week in city court. You will be aghast as to what you see in our judiciary.
But the other thing is, no matter what committee I'm on, even if it's something like natural resources or something like that, my entire focus is going to be to restrain government. Like with the Bureau of Land Management, as an example, on the Natural Resource Committee, I know for a fact the Constitution says government can only control, District of Columbia, basically, and whatever else is needed for, building spaces and whatever. It has no authority to control 600,000 acres of grazing land, none whatsoever. No authority to control Alaska.
Now you're just being a technocrat. Shame on you. Hey, listen, in our final couple seconds, please tell me and our listeners how a person can get hold of you and your candidacy.
The best thing is to go to my website. It's www.peterkonetchy, which is PeterKonetchy.com. So www.peterkonetchy.com. And the other, that's my alarm again. But the other thing is that I truly need money, because I'm not selling myself to special interests. I'm not selling myself to party. I'm not selling myself to anyone. So I could truly use donations, and there is a donation button on the website.
Very, very nice. Pete, do me a favor. Please have a great and happy Easter, and please tell Mrs. Konetchy the same.
You too.
Thank you for being on today.
Okay. All of your listeners. Thank you
very nice.
much.
Thank you.
Yep.
Listeners, we will talk to you next week. Have a great and safe Easter and a great week.
Brought to you by Renegade River